The storm had grounded every medevac in 3 counties, winds howling at 90 miles per hour through the mountain passes, visibility 0, but the cardiac patient in room 14 wouldn't wait for morning. Every pilot had refused the flight. Every crew chief had shaken their head. But the woman in the worn cardigan who played hymns on Sundays walked past the emergency room doors anyway, her fingers still smelling of communion bread, and climbed into the cockpit of the red and white Augusta that hadn't moved in 6 hours. She lifted off into the black fury while the snow erased her footprints from the landing pad, and by dawn, 2 lives had been saved by hands that officially belonged to no flight roster, no medical crew, no one's emergency plan at all. The Cedar Valley Medical Center perched on the eastern slope of the Cascades like a concrete prayer against the wilderness, its emergency lights cutting weak yellow lines through the November darkness. Wind screamed down from Mount Elias, carrying ice pellets that struck the windows with the sound of thrown gravel. The storm had been building for 18 hours, transforming the usually quiet mountain town of Millbrook into something from another planet entirely. Snowdrifts reached the first-floor windows of the hospital, and the parking lot had disappeared beneath 3 feet of white that showed no sign of stopping. Inside the trauma bay, Dr. Sarah Hendricks pressed her stethoscope against the chest of Marcus Bellefonte, a 62-year-old logger whose heart had decided this was the perfect night to stage its rebellion. The rhythm was irregular, dangerous, the kind of arrhythmia that could drop a man in seconds. His skin had gone gray, sweat beading, despite the chill that seemed to seep through every wall of the building. His wife sat in the corner, clutching a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, her eyes red from crying and sleeplessness. "We need to get him to Portland," Dr. Hendricks said quietly to the head nurse, Janet Morrison, who had worked these mountains for 30 years and had seen everything the wilderness could throw at the people who lived in its shadow. "His heart isn't going to hold until morning. The EKG shows he's in serious V-touch, and we don't have the equipment here for the procedure he needs." Janet glanced toward the windows where the storm raged with increasing fury. The glass trembled in its frames, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the groan of trees bending past their breaking point. "No one's flying in this, Doctor. I've already called Mountain Air Rescue, Life Flight, even the Coast Guard station down in Eugene. Every bird is grounded. The Weather Service is calling it a 100-year storm." Dr. Hendricks had practiced emergency medicine for 15 years, had seen hurricanes in Florida and blizzards in Minnesota, but she had never felt quite this helpless. The nearest cardiac surgery center was Oregon Health Sciences University in Portland, 120 miles of mountain highways that were currently impassable. Even if they could get an ambulance through, which was doubtful given the reports of avalanches and tree falls, it would take 4 hours minimum. Marcus Bellefonte didn't have 4 hours. The emergency department buzzed with the controlled chaos of a rural hospital pushed beyond its limits. 3 other patients waited in various states of distress. A rancher with a suspected broken hip from a fall on his icy steps, a teenager who had crashed his 4-wheeler into a snowbank and earned himself a concussion, and an elderly woman whose COPD was being aggravated by the dropping atmospheric pressure. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, but everyone could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on them, isolating them from the rest of the world. Outside, the hospital's helicopter pad sat empty except for the medical air transport Augusta A-109 that had been grounded since mid-afternoon. The aircraft, painted in the standard red and white of emergency medical services, looked small and fragile against the immense fury of the storm. Ice had formed along its rotor blades, and snow had drifted against its landing gear. The pilot, Jim Crawford, had taken one look at the latest weather reports and declared it a no-fly zone until further notice. He was a good pilot, experienced, with 20 years of mountain flying under his belt, but he wasn't suicidal. The winds aloft were gusting to over 100 miles per hour, with severe turbulence reported at all altitudes. Visibility was effectively 0, and the mountain passes were creating downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the ground before the pilot even knew what was happening. The flight nurse, Patricia Wells, had tried calling in favors from other services, but the story was the same everywhere. Aircraft grounded, crews on standby, waiting for the storm to pass. The forecast wasn't encouraging. The National Weather Service was predicting another 12 to 18 hours of severe conditions, with possible tornado activity in the lower elevations and continued heavy snow above 3,000 feet. For a small mountain hospital like Cedar Valley, it might as well have been the end of the world. In the basement of the building, the emergency generators hummed with steady persistence, their diesel engines consuming fuel at an alarming rate. The main power had flickered twice already, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the lines came down somewhere and they were running on backup systems alone. The heating system struggled against the cold that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice, and the staff had begun wearing extra layers under their scrubs. Dr. Hendricks made another check on Marcus Bellefonte, noting that his blood pressure had dropped another 10 points and his heart rate had become even more erratic. His wife, Eleanor, looked up with desperate eyes. They had been married 41 years, had raised 3 children in this valley, had weathered economic downturns and personal tragedies with the quiet strength that mountain people developed over time. But this was different. This was watching the person you loved most slip away while the very elements that had sustained their life in these mountains now conspired to end it. "Isn't there anything you can do?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some medicine, some treatment?" Dr. Hendricks knelt beside her, taking the older woman's hands in her own. "We're doing everything we can with what we have here, Mrs. Bellefonte. But your husband needs specialized surgery, the kind we can only do at a major hospital. His heart rhythm is becoming increasingly unstable, and we need to get him to Portland for a procedure called catheter ablation. Without it..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The communications radio crackled with updates from the outside world, none of them good. Interstate 84 through the Columbia River Gorge was closed due to ice and high winds. Highway 26 over Mount Hood was impassable, with multiple avalanches reported. Even the major highways in the valley were becoming treacherous as the snow continued to accumulate. The town of Millbrook was effectively cut off from the outside world, and the hospital was an island in a sea of white fury. Janet Morrison had worked through enough emergencies to know when they were approaching the limit of what could be accomplished with available resources. She had called in the off-duty staff who lived close enough to make it through the storm, but that was only 3 people. The on-call surgeon was snowed in at his home 15 miles up the valley, and the backup generator for the surgical suite had developed an intermittent fault that the maintenance crew was trying to repair with flashlights and prayer. In the administrative offices on the 2nd floor, Hospital Administrator Robert Gaines paced behind his desk, fielding calls from worried board members and trying to coordinate with county emergency management. The hospital served a population of 12,000 people scattered across 200 square miles of mountain terrain, and right now they were completely on their own. The State Emergency Management Agency had promised to send help as soon as conditions improved, but that was little comfort to the people who needed help right now. The wind howled with renewed fury, rattling windows and causing the building to creak in ways that suggested it was being tested near its limits. Snow continued to pile against the emergency room doors, and maintenance staff had to shovel them clear every hour to ensure ambulances could still reach the building. Not that any ambulances were moving tonight. The volunteer fire departments in the surrounding communities had reported that their vehicles couldn't navigate the roads, and several of their stations were without power. Dr. Hendricks checked her watch. 2:47 a.m. Marcus Bellefonte's condition continued to deteriorate, and she was running out of options. The cardiac medications they had were providing temporary stabilization at best, and she could see in his eyes the kind of fear that came from feeling your own body failing. Eleanor had moved her chair closer to his bedside and was holding his hand, whispering words of comfort that seemed inadequate against the magnitude of what they were facing. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, as if the mountains themselves were determined to prove that human technology and medicine were insignificant against the ancient power of wind and snow and cold. The emergency radio continued to report road closures, power outages, and communities cut off from outside help. Cedar Valley Medical Center was not alone in its isolation, but that provided little comfort to the people whose lives hung in the balance. Margaret Chen moved through the hospital corridors with the same quiet precision she brought to Sunday morning services at First Methodist, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder, the smell of fresh-baked cookies still clinging to her wool coat. She had been delivering her weekly batch of homemade treats to the night shift nurses for 3 years now, ever since her retirement from her job as the church's music director. At 61, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and sensible shoes that made no sound on the linoleum floors, She was the kind of person most people's eyes passed over without really seeing. The security guard at the main entrance, Tommy Reeves, barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle as she badged in with her volunteer credentials. Margaret had been coming here every Tuesday night since 2019, initially to play piano for patients who couldn't sleep, but gradually expanding her role to include whatever small acts of service the overworked staff needed. She knew which nurses preferred oatmeal cookies and which ones needed the chocolate chip variety. She knew that Dr. Patterson in pediatrics was diabetic and appreciated the sugar-free lemon bars she made with almond flour. She knew the rhythms of the hospital at night, when the daytime bustle gave way to the quieter emergencies that couldn't wait for morning. Tonight felt different. The storm had transformed the familiar corridors into something urgent and strained. Staff members moved with sharper purpose, their conversations conducted in the kind of hushed tones that suggested critical decisions were being made. Margaret noticed the way the nurses clustered around the communications desk, the way Dr. Hendricks kept checking her watch, the subtle signs of an institution pushed beyond its normal operating parameters. She made her usual rounds, distributing cookies to the grateful night shift workers, but her attention was increasingly drawn to the activity in the trauma bay. Through the partially open doors, she could see the familiar choreography of emergency medicine, monitors beeping their electronic warnings, the controlled urgency of medical professionals working against time, the family members hovering at the edges with the helpless anxiety that comes from watching someone you love fight for their life. Margaret had seen this dance before, though not in a hospital. She had seen it in field hospitals, in Afghanistan, in medevac helicopters over the mountains of Pakistan, in forward operating bases, where the difference between life and death often came down to how quickly you could get someone from where they were to where they needed to be. The muscle memory was still there, 25 years after she had hung up her flight helmet and traded military discipline for the gentler rhythms of church life. The way her eyes automatically tracked the vital signs monitors, the way her hands unconsciously calculated medication dosages, the way her mind began running through flight checklists whenever she heard the particular tone of voice that meant someone was running out of time. She paused outside the trauma bay, ostensibly arranging her bag of cookies but actually listening to the conversation between Dr. Hendricks and Nurse Morrison. The words were familiar: cardiac patient, unstable rhythm, need for immediate transport to a specialized facility. She had heard variations of this conversation hundreds of times during her years flying medevac missions for the Army, usually in conditions that made tonight's storm look like a mild inconvenience. The wind readings from the weather station are showing sustained gusts of 95 miles per hour, Nurse Morrison was saying, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had already explored every possible option. Jim Crawford says there's no way he's taking the Augusta up in this. The downdrafts through the passes would be suicidal. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the windows, where the storm continued its relentless assault on the building. She had flown in worse conditions, though not often and never by choice. There had been a mission outside Kandahar in 2003, extracting wounded soldiers during a sandstorm, with visibility measured in feet rather than miles. Another time, flying medical supplies to a remote outpost during a monsoon that had grounded every other aircraft in the theater. The key wasn't avoiding bad weather. It was understanding it, working with it, finding the narrow margins where physics and skill could overcome seemingly impossible conditions. Dr. Hendricks emerged from the trauma bay, her face showing the strain of someone carrying too much responsibility with too few resources. She nearly collided with Margaret, who had been standing quietly by the nurse's station, seemingly absorbed in sorting through her bag of homemade treats. "Oh, excuse me, Mrs. Chen," Dr. Hendricks said, the automatic politeness of someone whose mind was clearly elsewhere. "I didn't see you there." "No harm done, doctor," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the same calm tone she used when the church organ malfunctioned during the middle of a wedding ceremony. "Difficult night?" Dr. Hendricks paused, perhaps finding something comforting in the older woman's steady presence. Margaret had that effect on people. 3 decades of military service followed by years of pastoral care had taught her the value of simply being present when others were struggling. "We have a patient who needs to get to Portland for emergency cardiac surgery," Dr. Hendricks said, the words spilling out as if voicing them might somehow make the problem more manageable. "But with this storm, there's no way to get him there. Every flight service is grounded, the roads are impassable, and we're running out of time." Margaret nodded, her expression remaining neutral, But her mind was already working through the problem with the systematic approach that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments. She glanced toward the windows again, noting the direction of the wind by the way the snow was striking the glass, mentally calculating visibility conditions and atmospheric pressure variations. The storm was severe, certainly, but not impossible. The key would be timing, route selection, and understanding the specific characteristics of mountain weather patterns. "The patient," she said quietly. "How much time does he have?" Dr. Hendricks looked surprised by the question, as if she hadn't expected this unassuming church volunteer to engage with the medical complexities of the situation. "Maybe 4 hours before his condition becomes critical." "Why?" Margaret didn't answer directly. Instead, she walked to the windows that faced the helicopter pad, where the medical air transport Augusta sat buried under several inches of snow. She studied the aircraft with the kind of attention most people reserve for checking their phones, noting the ice accumulation on the rotor blades, the way the wind was affecting the tie-down straps, the subtle indicators that told her everything she needed to know about the machine's current condition. "That's an Augusta A109, isn't it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Twin engine, fully instrument rated for adverse weather conditions." Dr. Hendricks joined her at the window, looking puzzled. "Yes, but Jim Crawford, our pilot, says it's too dangerous to fly. The Weather Service is reporting severe turbulence and wind shear throughout the mountain passes." Margaret's eyes traced the familiar lines of the helicopter, remembering the feel of similar controls under her hands, the particular engine notes that indicated optimal performance, the delicate balance of cyclic and collective that could keep an aircraft stable in conditions that would defeat lesser pilots. She had logged over 3,000 hours in rotary wing aircraft, most of them in conditions that civilian pilots would never encounter. The Augusta was a good machine, reliable and forgiving, with safety margins built in for exactly this kind of situation. "Wind shear can be managed if you know the terrain," she said, almost to herself. "The key is understanding how the mountain valleys channel the airflow, where the downdrafts are strongest, which routes offer the most stable air masses." Dr. Hendricks stared at her, suddenly seeing something in the church organist's calm demeanor that hadn't been visible before. "You know something about helicopters?" Margaret smiled, the kind of small, self-contained expression that revealed nothing while acknowledging everything. "I used to do some flying, years ago. Different circumstances, of course." She didn't elaborate, and something in her tone suggested that further questions wouldn't be welcome. Instead, she continued studying the Augusta, with the focused attention of someone evaluating a complex problem from multiple angles. The aircraft was in good condition, well-maintained, with the kind of redundant safety systems that could handle mechanical failures even in adverse conditions. The real challenge would be navigation in zero visibility, but that was a problem she had solved before. "The route to Portland," she said, turning back to Dr. Hendricks, "does it typically go through the Columbia River Gorge?" Quote, "Usually, yes. It's the most direct path, and it avoids most of the high mountain peaks, but Jim says the wind conditions through the gorge are impossible right now." Margaret nodded, mentally visualizing the terrain. The Columbia River Gorge was notorious for creating wind tunnel effects, especially during severe weather events. But there were alternative routes, paths that followed the natural contours of the landscape and took advantage of the way mountains created both turbulence and shelter. She had flown similar terrain in Afghanistan, where understanding the local weather patterns could mean the difference between completing a mission and becoming another statistic in the casualty reports. "There might be other options," she said carefully, not wanting to raise false hopes but unable to ignore the growing certainty that this was a problem with a solution. Alternative routes that would avoid the worst of the wind conditions. Dr. Hendricks looked at her with new interest, perhaps beginning to sense that there was more to this quiet church volunteer than met the eye. "You sound like you know these mountains pretty well." "I grew up here," Margaret replied, which was true but not the complete truth. She had grown up in these mountains, but she had also spent 15 years studying mountain flying techniques in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. The principles were universal. Understand the weather, respect the aircraft's limitations, find the path of least resistance through the natural obstacles. Behind them, the trauma bay continued its urgent activity. Margaret could hear the distinctive beeping of cardiac monitors, the quick conversations between medical staff, the sound of someone fighting for their life while the storm raged outside. Time was running out, and the conventional solutions had all been exhausted. What remained was the possibility that unconventional solutions might succeed where traditional approaches had failed. She turned away from the window, her decision made, though not yet voiced. The Augusta was airworthy, the weather was manageable for someone with the right skills and experience, and the alternative was watching a good man die for want of transportation. It wasn't a difficult calculation, really. The hard part would be convincing people that the unassuming church organist standing in front of them had the capability to solve a problem that had stumped every official expert they had consulted. Margaret cleared her throat softly, the sound barely audible above the hum of medical equipment and the persistent howl of wind against the windows. Dr. Hendricks was reviewing Marcus Bellefonte's latest test results with Nurse Morrison, their voices carrying the particular tension that comes from watching options disappear one by one. The cardiac monitor continued its irregular rhythm, each beep a reminder that time was measured not in hours now, but in heartbeats. "Doctor," Margaret said, stepping forward with the same measured pace she used when approaching the organ bench on Sunday mornings. "I couldn't help but overhear about your patient's situation, the need to get him to Portland." Dr. Hendricks glanced up from the chart, her expression polite but distracted. "Yes, Mrs. Chen, it's a difficult situation, but I'm sure we'll figure something out." The words carried the automatic reassurance that medical professionals offered to worried family members, the kind of gentle deflection that kept civilians from getting too involved in complex medical decisions. "I was wondering," Margaret continued, her voice maintaining its usual calm register, "if you'd considered all the available flight options. Sometimes there are alternatives that aren't immediately obvious." Nurse Morrison looked up from her medications chart, her eyebrows slightly raised. Janet had known Margaret for 3 years, knew her as the quiet woman who brought cookies, and sometimes played soft piano music for patients who couldn't sleep. The idea that this church volunteer might have insights into emergency medical aviation was mildly amusing, though Janet was too professional to let it show. "We've been in contact with every flight service within 200 miles, Janet explained patiently. Mountain Air Rescue, Life Flight, even the military bases. Everyone's grounded because of the weather conditions. It's just too dangerous." Margaret nodded, acknowledging the information while carefully choosing her next words. 3 decades of military service had taught her the importance of timing when challenging established hierarchies. "I understand the weather is severe, but I've had some experience with helicopter operations in difficult conditions. Sometimes there are approaches that might work when conventional routes are impossible." Dr. Hendricks paused in her review of the test results, giving Margaret her full attention for the first time. There was something in the older woman's tone that suggested more than casual interest, but the idea seemed incongruous with everything she knew about the church organist. "Experience with helicopter operations?" "Some flight time, years ago," Margaret replied, deliberately understating her background. "I'm familiar with the Augusta model on your pad. It's a capable aircraft with good safety margins in adverse weather, assuming the pilot understands mountain flying techniques." From across the trauma bay, Jim Crawford looked up from his weather reports. He had been monitoring radio traffic from other flight services, hoping to hear that conditions were improving somewhere in the region, but the news remained consistently grim. The mention of his aircraft caught his attention, and he walked over to join the conversation. Jim was 54 years old, with graying hair and the kind of deep-set wrinkles that came from 20 years of squinting into bright skies and making split-second decisions in challenging conditions. He was a good pilot, respected by his peers, with an impeccable safety record built on conservative decision-making and thorough preparation. The idea that a civilian volunteer might be offering aviation advice struck him as presumptuous at best. "Excuse me," he interjected, his tone carrying the authority of professional expertise. "I couldn't help but hear you talking about the Augusta. I'm Jim Crawford, the medical transport pilot. I've been flying these mountains for 2 decades, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that nobody's going anywhere in this weather." Margaret turned to face him, her expression remaining neutral despite the edge in his voice. "I understand your concerns about the conditions. The weather reports are certainly intimidating." "It's not about intimidation," Jim replied, his voice rising slightly. "It's about physics. We've got sustained winds over 90 miles per hour, severe turbulence at all altitudes, and zero visibility. The downdrafts through the mountain passes would slam any aircraft into the ground before the pilot even knew what hit them." "The Columbia River Gorge route would certainly be problematic," Margaret agreed, "but there are alternative approaches that might avoid the worst of the wind conditions. The southern valleys, for instance, following the natural terrain contours rather than fighting against them. Quote, Jim stared at her with the expression of someone trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of the world. This woman, who looked like every church lady he had ever known, was discussing flight path alternatives with the kind of specific knowledge that suggested actual experience, but that was impossible. He knew every qualified pilot within 300 miles, and Margaret Chen wasn't among them. Mrs. Chen, he said, his tone becoming more patronizing, I appreciate your concern for our patient, but flight planning in severe weather conditions isn't something you can learn from watching the Discovery Channel. This requires years of specialized training and experience that, frankly, most civilian pilots never acquire. Dr. Hendricks watched the exchange with growing unease. She could sense the tension building between the two, but more importantly, she was beginning to notice something in Margaret's demeanor that suggested the woman wasn't speaking from theoretical knowledge. There was a calm confidence in her posture, a way of discussing technical details that indicated familiarity rather than speculation. Margaret, Dr. Hendricks said carefully, when you say you have flight experience, what exactly do you mean? Before Margaret could answer, Jim Crawford let out a short laugh. Doctor, with all due respect, I don't care if Mrs. Chen took flying lessons at the local airport 20 years ago. What we're dealing with here requires a level of expertise that takes decades to develop. I've got over 8,000 hours of mountain flying time, instrument ratings for adverse weather conditions, and certifications that most pilots never even attempt to obtain. And I'm telling you that this flight is impossible. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested that Jim's assumptions were not only wrong but insulting. She had commanded helicopter squadrons in combat zones, had flown medical evacuation missions in conditions that would have grounded civilian aircraft for weeks, had earned decorations for flights that other pilots had declared suicidal. But explaining that to these people would require revealing parts of her past that she had deliberately left behind when she retired to this quiet mountain community. I understand your position, she said, her voice remaining level despite the dismissive tone she was receiving. But sometimes experience comes from sources that aren't immediately obvious. Quote, Nurse Morrison stepped forward, her maternal instincts activated by what appeared to be an unnecessary conflict during an already stressful situation. Margaret, we all appreciate your willingness to help, but this really is something that requires specialized expertise. Jim's been our pilot for 8 years, and if he says it's too dangerous, then we need to trust his professional judgment. The words stung more than Margaret had expected, not because they questioned her abilities, but because they revealed how completely her neighbors had misunderstood who she was. For 15 years, she had attended church services, played hymns for weddings and funerals, baked cookies for hospital volunteers, and participated in community events as Margaret Chen, the quiet music teacher. The fact that she had also been Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Chen, commander of the 3rd Medical Evacuation Squadron, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, and veteran of over 200 combat missions, was information she had never shared with anyone in Millbrook. Of course, she said, her voice betraying none of the frustration she felt, I wouldn't want to interfere with professional protocols. Jim Crawford nodded approvingly, satisfied that the civilian had been properly educated about the realities of aviation. Look, Mrs. Chen, I know this is frustrating. We all want to help Marcus, but sometimes the weather just doesn't cooperate. The best thing we can do is keep him stable here until conditions improve. Dr. Hendricks felt the weight of professional responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She was the attending physician, the one who would have to explain to Marcus Bellefonte why her husband couldn't receive the treatment that might save his life. The conversation between Jim and Margaret had revealed no new options, had only confirmed what she already knew. They were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. How long before conditions might improve, she asked Jim, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The National Weather Service is predicting another 12 to 16 hours of severe weather, he replied, consulting his phone for the latest updates. Even after the storm passes, we'll need time for the maintenance crew to clear ice from the aircraft and conduct pre-flight safety checks. Realistically, we're looking at 18 to 20 hours minimum. The numbers hit Margaret like physical blows. 18 hours was longer than Marcus Bellefonte had, longer than any cardiac patient in his condition could reasonably be expected to survive without specialized intervention. She had seen similar cases during her military service, had understood the narrow window of opportunity that existed between the onset of serious cardiac arrhythmia and irreversible organ damage. The mathematics of human physiology were unforgiving. She looked around the trauma bay, taking in the scene with the analytical eye that had served her during countless emergency situations. The medical equipment was modern and well-maintained, the staff was competent and professional, but they were operating within the constraints of a rural hospital's limited resources. What they needed was not better medicine, but better logistics. They needed someone who could move their patient from where he was to where he needed to be, regardless of the obstacles nature had placed in the way. "I should let you get back to your patient," she said finally, recognizing that further discussion would only create more tension without changing anyone's mind. "If there's anything else I can do to help, please let me know." Dr. Hendricks nodded absently, already turning her attention back to Marcus Bellefonte's chart. Nurse Morrison offered a sympathetic smile, the kind reserved for well-meaning volunteers who didn't quite understand the complexities of professional health care. Jim Crawford had already returned to his weather reports, confident that he had handled an awkward situation with appropriate authority. Margaret walked away from the trauma bay with measured steps, her face revealing nothing of the calculations running through her mind. She had been dismissed, patronized, and essentially told to mind her own business by people who had no idea what she was capable of accomplishing. It was a familiar feeling, one she had experienced many times during her early military career, when senior officers had underestimated her because of her size, her gender, or her quiet demeanor. The difference was that in the military, eventually her results had spoken louder than other people's assumptions. She paused at the nurse's station, ostensibly organizing her volunteer supplies, but actually studying the activity around the trauma bay. The urgency was increasing, she noticed. The intervals between medication adjustments were getting shorter. The conversations between staff members were becoming more clipped and focused. Marcus Bellefonte was running out of time, and everyone in the trauma bay knew it. Behind her, she could hear Jim Crawford explaining to Dr. Hendricks why civilian authorities sometimes made unrealistic demands on aviation professionals. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never been proven wrong about weather conditions, who had built his reputation on conservative decision-making and careful risk assessment. He was, by all measures, a competent and responsible pilot. He was also wrong about what was possible on a night like this, but proving that would require her to reveal capabilities she had spent 5 years keeping hidden from her neighbors. The storm continued its assault on the building, but Margaret had stopped hearing it as noise. Instead, she heard it as data. Wind direction, velocity variations. The particular sound that indicated turbulence patterns were shifting. Her mind automatically processed the information, building a three-dimensional model of the current atmospheric conditions and how they might be navigated by someone with the right skills and equipment. She gathered her things and headed toward the exit, knowing that her presence was no longer welcome in the medical discussions. But as she walked past the windows that faced the helicopter pad, she paused for one more look at the Augusta A-109 sitting silent in the storm. The aircraft was covered with snow and ice, looking abandoned and unusable to anyone who didn't understand the robust engineering that made modern helicopters capable of operating in conditions that would have been impossible 20 years ago. Margaret Chen, church organist and volunteer, walked toward the hospital exit with her empty cookie containers. But Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Chen, combat veteran and master of rotary wing aircraft, was already planning a flight path through the mountains that would get Marcus Bellefonte to Portland before his heart gave out entirely. The cardiac monitor's alarm pierced through the controlled chaos of the trauma bay at 3:42 a.m., its shrill electronic warning cutting through conversations and causing every head to turn toward Marcus Bellefonte's bed. "Doctor." Hendricks rushed to his side, her stethoscope already in hand, while Nurse Morrison began adjusting medication dosages with the swift precision of someone who had seen this scenario play out too many times before. The numbers on the monitor told a story that everyone in the room could read. Ventricular tachycardia at 180 beats per minute, blood pressure dropping to dangerous levels, oxygen saturation beginning to decline despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through his nasal cannula. "He's going into V-fib," Dr. Hendricks announced, her voice carrying the particular tension that came from watching a manageable situation spiral toward the unmanageable. "Get me the defibrillator and call respiratory therapy. We're going to need to consider intubation if his oxygen levels don't stabilize." Eleanor Bellefonte pressed herself against the wall, her face pale with the kind of terror that comes from understanding just enough medical terminology to know that the numbers flashing on the screen were not moving in the right direction. Her husband's breathing had become labored, shallow gasps that seemed to require enormous effort, and his skin had taken on the gray pallor that she had seen once before, years ago, when her father had suffered his final heart attack in this same hospital. The defibrillator cart arrived with the metallic rattle of equipment being moved too quickly, pushed by Tom Nakamura, the respiratory therapist who had been called in from home when the storm made it clear that the hospital would need all available staff. Tom had driven through conditions that should have kept him safely indoors, navigating roads that were barely passable, because he understood that rural hospitals didn't have the luxury of large staff rosters during emergency situations. "Charging to 200 joules, Dr. Hendricks called out, while Nurse Morrison applied conductive gel to the defibrillator paddles. The familiar routine of emergency cardiac care unfolded with practiced efficiency, but everyone in the room knew they were treating symptoms rather than the underlying problem. Marcus Bellefonte's heart was failing because of electrical conduction abnormalities that required specialized intervention, the kind of cardiac catheterization and ablation procedure that could only be performed at a major medical center. The defibrillator discharged with its characteristic whine and thump, causing Marcus's body to convulse briefly before settling back onto the bed. The monitor showed a momentary return to normal rhythm, then began climbing again toward the dangerous territory of ventricular arrhythmia. Dr. Hendricks checked her watch and made a notation on the chart, documenting another temporary stabilization that everyone knew wouldn't last. "How long can we keep doing this?" Eleanor asked from her position against the wall, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that followed the defibrillation. Dr. Hendricks met her eyes with the honesty that rural medicine sometimes demanded. "Each episode puts more strain on his heart muscle. We can manage the immediate crisis, but without definitive treatment, we're fighting a losing battle. His heart is essentially short-circuiting, and every time we shock it back into rhythm, we're causing additional damage to the cardiac tissue." From his position near the weather monitoring station, Jim Crawford looked up from the latest meteorological reports with growing frustration. The storm system had not only failed to weaken, but appeared to be intensifying as it moved through the mountain passes. Wind speeds were now being recorded at over 100 miles per hour in some locations, with visibility remaining at near zero throughout the region. The automated weather stations scattered through the Cascade Range were reporting conditions that would ground military aircraft, let alone civilian medical helicopters. "Still no improvement in the forecast," he announced to no one in particular, though his words carried clearly to everyone in the trauma bay. "If anything, conditions are getting worse. The Weather Service is now calling this a once-in-a-generation storm event." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, confirming what everyone already suspected: that conventional rescue options had been exhausted, that the normal systems designed to handle medical emergencies in rural areas had been overwhelmed by forces beyond human control. The hospital was an island of modern medicine surrounded by a sea of natural fury, fully equipped to diagnose Marcus Bellefonte's condition, but powerless to provide the treatment that could save his life. "Doctor?" Hendricks stepped away from the bedside to check on her other patients, but her attention remained divided between multiple medical crises that were developing simultaneously. The elderly woman with COPD was showing signs of respiratory distress, her condition aggravated by the dropping atmospheric pressure that accompanied the storm system. The teenager with the head injury was complaining of increasing nausea and dizziness, symptoms that suggested his concussion was more serious than initially assessed. The rancher with a suspected hip fracture was developing complications that might require surgical intervention they weren't equipped to provide. "We're running low on several critical medications," Nurse Morrison reported quietly, reviewing the pharmacy inventory on her tablet. "The storm has prevented our usual supply deliveries, and we're using more drugs than normal because of the increased patient load. If we have to keep stabilizing Marcus every hour or two, we'll exhaust our cardiac medication supply before morning." The implications were clear even to the non-medical staff present. The hospital was not only isolated by weather but was also consuming resources at an unsustainable rate while treating patients whose conditions required interventions that weren't available locally. They were trapped in a situation where doing nothing would result in preventable deaths, but continuing their current course would eventually lead to the same outcome through resource depletion. From the administrative offices upstairs, Hospital Administrator Robert Gaines descended to the emergency department with updates from his conversations with state and federal emergency management agencies. His expression suggested that the news was not encouraging. The National Guard had medical helicopters that could theoretically operate in severe weather conditions, but they were currently deployed to assist with evacuation operations in the Portland metropolitan area, where the storm had caused widespread power outages and flooding in low-lying neighborhoods. FEMA is aware of our situation, he reported to Dr. Hendricks, but they can't promise any assistance until the weather improves. The military bases are dealing with their own emergency responses, and civilian air ambulance services are grounded across the entire Pacific Northwest. We're essentially on our own until this storm system moves through. Quote, the words confirmed what everyone had already begun to suspect, that the normal safety nets designed to support rural hospitals during crisis situations had been overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the weather event they were experiencing. The systems that worked well during localized emergencies were inadequate when faced with a regional disaster that affected multiple states simultaneously. Marcus Bellefonte's cardiac monitor began showing irregular patterns again, the electronic beeping becoming more frequent and erratic. Dr. Hendricks returned to his bedside, noting that his blood pressure had dropped another 10 points and his oxygen saturation was declining despite maximum supplemental oxygen. The medications that had been providing temporary stabilization were becoming less effective with each episode, a phenomenon she had seen before in patients whose cardiac tissue was becoming increasingly damaged by repeated electrical abnormalities. We need to discuss intubation, she said to Tom Nakamura, who had remained in the trauma bay monitoring the patient's respiratory status. His breathing is becoming more labored, and if he goes into full cardiac arrest, we'll need to be prepared for aggressive life support measures. The decision to intubate would commit them to a course of action that would be difficult to reverse without specialized equipment and expertise. Once Marcus was on mechanical ventilation, he would require constant monitoring and intensive care support that would strain the hospital's already limited resources. But the alternative was watching his condition deteriorate to the point where no intervention would be possible. Eleanor Bellefonte heard the medical discussions swirling around her husband's bed and understood enough to know that the doctors were running out of options. She had been married to Marcus for 41 years, had raised 3 children with him, had watched him survive logging accidents and economic downturns with the quiet resilience that mountain people developed over generations of facing hardship. But this was different. This was watching the person she loved most slip away while the very elements that had sustained their life in these mountains now conspired to prevent the help he needed. There has to be something, she said, her voice carrying the desperation of someone who refused to accept that modern medicine could be defeated by weather. Some way to get him to Portland, some pilot who's willing to try. People used to fly in weather like this during the war, didn't they? Before all this modern equipment? Dr. Hendricks paused in her medication calculations, struck by something in Eleanor's words that resonated with a half-remembered conversation. Earlier in the evening, the church organist had mentioned something about alternative flight routes, had spoken about helicopter operations with the kind of specific knowledge that suggested more than casual familiarity. At the time, Jim Crawford's dismissive response had seemed reasonable, but now, with Marcus Bellefonte's condition deteriorating and no other options available, Dr. Hendricks found herself wondering if they had been too quick to discount an unconventional possibility. "Mrs. Morrison," she said quietly, "that woman who was here earlier, Mrs. Chen from the church, she seemed to know something about helicopters. Do you think she might still be in the building?" Nurse Morrison glanced toward the windows where the storm continued its relentless assault, then back at the cardiac monitor where Marcus Bellefonte's heart rhythm was becoming increasingly unstable. "She left about 20 minutes ago, but she usually doesn't go home right away. Sometimes she sits in the chapel for a while before driving back to town." The hospital chapel was located on the ground floor, a small interfaith space that provided quiet refuge for families dealing with medical crises and staff members who needed a few minutes away from the intensity of emergency medicine. If Margaret Chen was indeed still in the building, she would most likely be found there, probably praying for the patients she had encountered during her volunteer rounds. Dr. Hendricks looked at Marcus Bellefonte's increasingly unstable vital signs, then at Eleanor's desperate expression, then at the weather reports that continued to show impossible flying conditions throughout the region. Conventional wisdom and professional protocols suggested that they had exhausted all reasonable options, that the responsible course of action was to continue supportive care and hope for the best. But conventional wisdom had never felt quite so much like a death sentence. "I'm going to find Mrs. Chen," she announced, surprising herself with the decision even as she spoke the words. "There might be something we haven't considered, some option we've overlooked." Quote, Jim Crawford looked up from his weather monitoring equipment with an expression of disbelief. "Doctor, with all due respect, I've already explained why flight operations are impossible in these conditions. Having a civilian volunteer confirm what I've already told you isn't going to change the physics of the situation." But Dr. Hendricks was already heading toward the door, driven by the kind of desperate hope that comes from watching people die when you know that somewhere, somehow, there might be a solution that nobody has been willing to consider. Behind her, Marcus Bellefonte's cardiac monitor continued its electronic warning, counting down the minutes until professional caution would no longer matter because there would be no one left to save. Dr. Hendricks found Margaret Chen in the hospital chapel, seated in the back pew with her hands folded in her lap, her gray wool coat still buttoned against the cold that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. The small interfaith space was dimly lit by emergency lighting, its stained glass windows black against the storm outside. Margaret wasn't praying, exactly, but rather sitting in the kind of contemplative stillness that comes from years of military service and the habit of processing complex situations in quiet moments before making irreversible decisions. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Hendricks said softly, not wanting to startle the older woman but needing to speak before her courage failed entirely. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to ask you something about what you said earlier. About alternative flight routes." Margaret looked up with the calm expression she had worn throughout the earlier conversation, showing no surprise at being sought out in the chapel. "How is your patient doing, doctor?" "Not well," Dr. Hendricks admitted, settling into the pew beside Margaret with the weight of someone carrying too much responsibility. "His condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. We've had 2 more episodes of ventricular tachycardia in the last half hour, and each one is harder to correct than the last. Without the specialized procedure he needs, I don't think he'll survive another 6 hours." Margaret nodded, acknowledging the medical reality without offering false comfort. She had seen similar situations during her military service, had understood the narrow window between treatable conditions and irreversible organ failure. The mathematics of cardiac medicine were unforgiving, particularly when complicated by the isolation that mountain weather could impose. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Dr. Hendricks continued, "about having flight experience. I realize this might sound desperate, but we've exhausted every official channel. The National Guard is deployed elsewhere. All civilian air ambulance services are grounded, and even the military bases say they can't help until conditions improve. I'm wondering if there might be something we haven't considered." Before Margaret could respond, Dr. Hendricks's pager buzzed with an urgent message from the trauma bay. Marcus Bellefonte was experiencing another cardiac episode, this one more severe than the previous incidents. The 2 women hurried back through the corridors, where they found the emergency team gathered around the patient's bed with the controlled urgency that indicated a critical situation. "V-fib arrest," Nurse Morrison announced as they entered the trauma bay. "We've been doing CPR for 3 minutes. Tom's preparing for intubation if we can get him back." The defibrillator discharged again, causing Marcus's body to arch off the bed, before settling back into stillness. The cardiac monitor showed a brief return to organized rhythm, then began climbing toward dangerous territory once more. Eleanor Bellefonte had been moved to a chair across the room, where she sat clutching her husband's wallet and watch, the personal items that had been removed during the resuscitation efforts. Dr. Hendricks took her position at the bedside, checking pulse and pupil response while the respiratory therapist prepared the intubation equipment. The patient was unconscious now, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin taking on the mottled appearance that indicated poor circulation. They had perhaps minutes before the next cardiac arrest, and each episode was causing cumulative damage to his heart muscle and brain tissue. "Doctor," came a voice from the doorway. "I have Administrator Gaines on the line. He says it's urgent." Dr. Hendricks accepted the phone while continuing to monitor Marcus's vital signs, hoping that the hospital administration had found some solution that the medical staff had overlooked. Robert Gaines had been working his contacts throughout the night, calling in favors from his years in hospital management, trying to find any resource that might break through the wall of impossible circumstances they were facing. Sarah? Gaines's voice came through clearly despite the static that seemed to affect all electronic communications during the storm. I'd been on the phone with the Regional Emergency Management Coordinator. They're telling me that FEMA has declared this a federal disaster area which should open up additional resources for medical evacuations. What kind of resources? Dr. Hendricks asked, though she could already sense from his tone that the news wasn't as encouraging as it initially sounded. That's the problem, Gaines continued. The federal resources are mostly tied up with the urban areas that have been hit hardest by the storm. Portland has over 50,000 people without power, and there are flood evacuations happening throughout the Willamette Valley. The military helicopters that could handle these weather conditions are all committed to those operations. Dr. Hendricks felt the familiar weight of rural medicine settling on her shoulders, the understanding that small mountain hospitals were often the last priority when resources had to be allocated during large-scale emergencies. The same isolation that made communities like Millbrook appealing to people seeking quiet mountain living also made them vulnerable when disasters overwhelmed the normal support systems. How long before they might be able to help us? She asked, though Marcus Bellefonte's deteriorating condition suggested that timing was no longer measured in hours. The earliest estimate is 18 to 24 hours, Gaines replied, and that's only if the storm conditions improve enough to allow flight operations. Right now, even the military is grounded except for life-threatening evacuations in urban areas. The words confirmed what Dr. Hendricks had already begun to suspect, that the bureaucratic systems designed to handle medical emergencies were overwhelmed by the scale of the current disaster. The protocols that worked well during normal circumstances were inadequate when faced with a regional weather event that affected multiple states simultaneously. Marcus Bellefonte's life was competing for resources with thousands of other emergency situations, and rural hospitals like Cedar Valley were simply not the priority. She handed the phone back to the nurse and returned her attention to the patient, whose cardiac monitor was showing increasingly irregular patterns. The medications that had been providing temporary stabilization were becoming less effective with each episode, and his blood pressure had dropped to levels that indicated shock. Without immediate intervention, they were looking at complete cardiac failure within the next few hours. What about private companies? Nurse Morrison suggested, pulling up contact information on her tablet. There are helicopter services that do mountain rescue operations, wilderness emergency response. Maybe someone who specializes in extreme weather flying. The suggestion triggered a flurry of phone calls to aviation companies throughout the Pacific Northwest, but the responses were uniformly negative. Mountain rescue organizations had grounded their aircraft 12 hours ago, when wind speeds exceeded their safety protocols. Wilderness emergency services were dealing with multiple search and rescue operations that had been suspended due to weather conditions. Even the most experienced mountain pilots acknowledged that the current storm system presented conditions that were beyond the capabilities of civilian aircraft and crews. Jim Crawford, who had been monitoring the conversations from his position near the weather station, felt vindicated in his earlier assessment of the situation. "I tried to tell you that this weather is beyond what anyone can safely handle," he said to Dr. Hendricks. "These aren't conditions where you can take calculated risks. The downdrafts through the mountain passes would destroy any aircraft that tried to navigate them." But as the official channels continued to fail, Dr. Hendricks found herself thinking again about Margaret Chen's calm confidence when discussing flight operations. The church organist had spoken about helicopter capabilities and mountain weather patterns with the kind of specific knowledge that suggested real experience, not theoretical understanding. Jim Crawford's dismissal had seemed reasonable at the time, but now, with Marcus Bellefonte dying and no other options available, she wondered if they had been too quick to discount an unconventional possibility. Margaret had remained quiet during the series of phone calls and consultations, observing the increasingly desperate attempts to find official solutions to what was essentially a logistics problem. She understood the bureaucratic constraints that were preventing help from reaching Marcus Bellefonte, had dealt with similar situations during her military career, when official channels proved inadequate for emergency situations. The difference was that in combat zones, commanders were authorized to make decisions that prioritize mission success over regulatory compliance. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Hendricks said, turning to address the older woman directly, "you mentioned earlier that you had some flight experience. I know this is going to sound presumptuous, but given our situation, I have to ask. Is there any possibility that you might be qualified to operate the medical helicopter?" The question hung in the air like an electric charge, causing several staff members to look up from their duties, with expressions ranging from surprise to disbelief. The idea that a church volunteer might possess the specialized skills required for emergency medical aviation seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about professional competence and regulatory authority. Jim Crawford's reaction was immediate and emphatic. "Doctor, I have to object to this line of thinking. Medical helicopter operations require specific certifications, extensive training, and experience that takes years to develop. You can't just put someone in the cockpit because they took flying lessons at some point in their past." "I understand the regulatory requirements," Dr. Hendricks replied, her voice carrying the strain of someone who had exhausted conventional options and was beginning to consider unconventional ones. "But our patient is dying. Every official channel has failed us, and we're running out of time. If there's even a possibility that Mrs. Chen has the qualifications needed, don't we have an obligation to explore it?" Margaret met Dr. Hendricks's gaze with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the night, but something in her eyes suggested that the question had touched on information she had deliberately kept private. "The regulatory requirements for medical aviation are indeed complex," she said carefully. "But there are circumstances where emergency conditions might override normal protocols." The answer was diplomatic, but uninformative, revealing neither her qualifications nor her willingness to become involved in what would clearly be an unauthorized flight operation. Jim Crawford interpreted her response as confirmation of his assessment that civilian volunteers had no business discussing aviation matters during emergency situations. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your desire to help," he said with the patronizing tone that had characterized his earlier interactions with her, "but what we're dealing with here requires the highest levels of professional expertise. This isn't a situation where good intentions can substitute for proper training and certification." But Dr. Hendricks was studying Margaret's face with the diagnostic skills that had served her throughout 15 years of emergency medicine. There was something in the older woman's demeanor that suggested she was withholding information, that her careful responses were designed to avoid revealing capabilities rather than acknowledge limitations. The possibility that they had overlooked a qualified pilot because of assumptions about age, gender, and occupation was beginning to seem less absurd and more like the kind of oversight that could prove fatal. Marcus Bellefonte's cardiac monitor began showing the irregular patterns that indicated another episode was approaching, and Eleanor's quiet sobbing provided a constant reminder that time was measured in heartbeats rather than hours. The storm continued its assault on the building, but inside the trauma bay, the real enemy was bureaucratic paralysis and the unwillingness to consider solutions that didn't fit within established protocols and professional hierarchies. Margaret excused herself from the trauma bay with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the night, mentioning that she needed to retrieve something from her car. No one paid particular attention to her departure. The medical staff was focused on Marcus Bellefonte's deteriorating condition, and Jim Crawford was busy explaining to anyone who would listen why civilian volunteers shouldn't be discussing aviation during emergency situations. The automatic doors slid shut behind her as she stepped into the hospital's main corridor, leaving the controlled chaos of the emergency department for the relative quiet of the administrative areas. But instead of heading toward the parking garage, Margaret turned toward the hospital's maintenance section, where she knew the building's operational systems were monitored and controlled. The night maintenance supervisor, Carl Rodriguez, had been working double shifts since the storm began, monitoring backup generators and ensuring that critical systems remained functional, despite the power fluctuations caused by the severe weather. Margaret had spoken with him during previous volunteer visits, knew him as a conscientious professional who took pride in keeping the hospital running under difficult conditions. "Carl," she said, approaching the maintenance office where he was reviewing electrical load reports on a bank of computer monitors. "I need to ask you about accessing the helicopter pad, the medical transport aircraft. Is there a way to reach it without going through the main emergency exits?" Carl looked up from his screens with mild curiosity. He knew Margaret as the church organist who brought cookies to the night shift, had always found her to be polite and undemanding in her interactions with hospital staff. The question seemed unusual, but the night had been full of unusual situations, and he was too tired to wonder about motivations. "There's a maintenance access door on the north side," he replied, pointing toward a corridor that led away from the main hospital areas. "It opens directly onto the landing pad. We use it for routine inspections and cleaning." "But Mrs. Chen, with this weather, you don't want to be outside unless it's absolutely necessary. The wind out there could knock you down." Margaret nodded her understanding while memorizing the route he had indicated. "I just need to check on something. The door, is it locked with a security system?" "Standard keypad lock," Carl said, writing the access code on a piece of paper. "But seriously, be careful out there. I've been monitoring the weather stations, and conditions are getting worse, not better. Sustained winds over 100 miles per hour in some areas, with gusts that could be dangerous even for someone just walking across the pad." She thanked him and made her way through the hospital's service corridors, areas that most visitors never saw but which were familiar to her from years of volunteer work. The maintenance passages were dimly lit and utilitarian, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that carried the hospital's life-supporting systems throughout the building. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh shadows, and the constant hum of mechanical equipment provided a backdrop to the storm sounds that penetrated even the thick concrete walls. The access door opened onto a world transformed by the fury of nature. Wind hit Margaret with physical force, driving snow into her face and making it difficult to maintain her footing on the ice-covered concrete. The helicopter pad was barely visible through the blowing snow, illuminated only by the emergency lighting system that outlined the landing area. The Augusta A-109 sat in the center of the pad like a sleeping metal bird, its red and white paint scheme dulled by accumulated ice and snow. Margaret forced herself to walk steadily across the pad, leaning into the wind and placing each step carefully on the treacherous surface. She had experienced similar conditions during winter operations in Afghanistan, where helicopter missions continued regardless of weather because lives depended on maintaining logistical support to remote outposts. The principles of cold weather aviation were universal. Understand the environment, respect the equipment's limitations, and never let challenging conditions prevent you from accomplishing necessary missions. The aircraft was in better condition than she had expected. Ice had accumulated on the rotor blades and engine cowlings, but not to the extent that would require extensive de-icing procedures. The landing gear was solid, the fuselage showed no signs of damage from wind-blown debris, and the cockpit windows were intact despite the battering they had received from the storm. This was a well-maintained machine, serviced by professionals who understood the demands of mountain flying operations. Margaret began a systematic exterior inspection, following the same procedures she had used during hundreds of pre-flight checks in military service. She ran her gloved hands along the rotor blade attachments, checking for ice buildup that might affect aerodynamic performance. She examined the engine intakes for foreign object debris, tested the security of access panels, and verified that control surfaces moved freely despite the cold temperatures. The inspection took 15 minutes, conducted methodically despite the brutal weather conditions. The cockpit door was unlocked, protected only by the assumption that no unauthorized person would attempt to access an aircraft during a severe storm. Margaret slid into the pilot's seat, immediately struck by the familiar layout of instruments and controls that differed in detail but not in fundamental design from the military helicopters she had flown for 15 years. The Augusta was more sophisticated than the older UH-60 she remembered, with modern avionics and computerized flight management systems, but the basic principles remained unchanged. She activated the battery systems and watched the instrument panel come to life with familiar electronic displays. The fuel gauges showed full tanks, the hydraulic systems indicated normal pressure, and the engine monitoring systems displayed ready status despite the cold temperatures. This was an aircraft prepared for immediate deployment, maintained at the high standards required for medical emergency operations. Jim Crawford might lack the courage to fly in severe weather, but he clearly understood the importance of keeping his machine in perfect operational condition. Margaret pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket and began copying information from the flight management computer. Weather data from automated stations throughout the region, terrain elevation profiles for various flight routes, radio frequencies for emergency services, and air traffic control. She had developed the habit during her military career of gathering all available information before making critical decisions, of building comprehensive situational awareness that would allow her to adapt to changing conditions during flight operations. The weather information confirmed what she had already suspected. Conventional flight routes were indeed impossible under current conditions. The Columbia River Gorge was experiencing wind speeds that would create severe turbulence and downdrafts capable of overwhelming any aircraft. The primary mountain passes showed similar conditions. with visibility reduced to near zero and atmospheric instability that would make navigation extremely hazardous for pilots depending on standard instrument flight procedures. But Margaret had not survived 2 combat deployments by limiting herself to conventional approaches. She began plotting alternative routes on the aircraft's navigation system, following terrain features that would provide natural windbreaks and avoiding areas where mountain topography would create the most severe turbulence. The southern approach to Portland, following the river valleys and staying below the ridgelines, would add distance, but might offer more stable air masses. It was a route that required intimate knowledge of mountain flying techniques and confidence in one's ability to navigate by terrain recognition rather than electronic systems. She spent 20 minutes familiarizing herself with the aircraft's specific systems and capabilities, reading through the emergency procedures checklist, and verifying that all required safety equipment was properly stowed. The Augusta was equipped with sophisticated weather radar, terrain-following navigation systems, and redundant communication equipment that would allow her to maintain contact with emergency services throughout the flight. More importantly, it was certified for single-pilot operations in adverse weather conditions, with automated systems that could assist with navigation and flight control during critical phases of the mission. Margaret climbed out of the cockpit and conducted a final exterior inspection, paying particular attention to the engine air intakes and rotor head assembly. The ice accumulation was manageable, well within the limits that the aircraft was designed to handle during cold weather operations. The tie-down straps and protective covers could be removed quickly when the time came for departure, and the auxiliary power unit would provide the electrical power needed to warm the engines before startup. Satisfied with the aircraft's condition, she made her way back through the storm to the maintenance access door, her mind already processing the logistics of an unauthorized medical evacuation flight. The distance to Portland was approximately 120 nautical miles, which would require roughly 90 minutes of flight time under normal conditions. With the current weather, she estimated 2 hours minimum, possibly longer if she had to deviate significantly from direct routing to avoid the worst turbulence areas. Back inside the hospital, Margaret made her way to the administrative offices, where she knew personnel records were maintained in both electronic and paper formats. The night security officer, who had been monitoring alarm systems and conducting routine patrols, barely glanced up as she passed through areas that were technically restricted to hospital employees. Her volunteer badge and familiar face provided the kind of informal clearance that small hospitals often extended to trusted community members. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She located the files containing pilot certification records and aircraft operation manuals, documents that Jim Crawford would have been required to maintain as part of his employment with the Medical Transport Service. The information confirmed what she had already determined from her aircraft inspection. The Augusta was fully certified for instrument flight operations in adverse weather, equipped with de-icing systems and emergency equipment that exceeded minimum regulatory requirements. More importantly, she found documentation indicating that the aircraft was covered by federal emergency authorization protocols that would allow operation by any qualified pilot during declared disaster conditions. The language was deliberately broad, designed to permit flexibility during emergency situations when normal regulatory procedures might prevent life-saving operations. Margaret photographed the relevant pages with her phone, ensuring she would have legal justification for any actions she might take. Her final stop was the hospital's communications center, where she accessed current weather radar imagery and flight planning resources that were more detailed than what was available through the aircraft's onboard systems. The storm system was indeed massive, covering most of the Pacific Northwest, with varying intensities of precipitation and wind. But satellite imagery showed areas of relative stability, corridors where atmospheric conditions were less severe and might permit careful navigation by an experienced pilot. Margaret studied the data for 15 minutes, memorizing wind patterns and precipitation intensities that would affect her planned flight route. The information confirmed her initial assessment. The mission was dangerous but not impossible, requiring skills and experience that exceeded normal civilian aviation standards but were well within the capabilities of someone trained in military emergency operations. The key would be timing the departure to coincide with a temporary lull in storm intensity that the weather models predicted might occur within the next hour. She returned to the trauma bay to find Marcus Bellefonte in the midst of another cardiac episode. His family gathered around the bed while medical staff worked to stabilize his increasingly erratic heart rhythm. The scene carried the particular intensity that indicated a patient approaching the limits of what supportive care could accomplish, the point where further delay would make specialized intervention irrelevant. Dr. Hendricks looked up as Margaret entered, her expression showing the strain of someone who had exhausted conventional options and was beginning to confront the possibility of failure. "Mrs. Chen, I'm glad you're back. I was hoping we might continue our earlier conversation about flight possibilities." Margaret met her gaze with calm certainty, the kind of steady confidence that came from having made irreversible decisions and committed to courses of action that others might consider impossible. "Doctor, I believe there may be a way to get your patient to Portland tonight, but it would require some flexibility regarding normal procedures and protocols." Margaret stepped closer to Marcus Bellefonte's bedside, her trained eye automatically assessing the patient's condition with the clinical detachment that had served her during countless medical evacuations in combat zones. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor that indicated severe cardiac compromise, his breathing was shallow and labored despite supplemental oxygen, and the cardiac monitor showed the kind of irregular rhythm that preceded complete cardiovascular collapse. She had seen similar cases during her military service, understood the narrow window between treatable conditions and irreversible organ failure. "Doctor," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that hadn't been present during their earlier conversations. "Your patient has perhaps 2 hours before his condition becomes irreversible. The cardiac tissue damage from repeated arrhythmia episodes will soon reach the point where even successful surgery won't restore normal function." Dr. Hendricks looked up from the medication chart she had been reviewing, struck by the specificity of Margaret's assessment and the confident way she had delivered it. "You sound like you've seen cases like this before." "I have," Margaret replied, reaching into her coat pocket to withdraw a weathered leather wallet. From it, she extracted a military identification card that she had carried for 30 years but hadn't shown to anyone in Millbrook during the 5 years since her retirement. "Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Chen, United States Army Medical Service Corps. I commanded the 3rd Medical Evacuation Squadron during 2 deployments in Afghanistan." The words fell into the trauma bay like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that spread outward from where Margaret stood. Dr. Hendricks stared at the military ID, noting the serious expression in the younger woman's photograph and the list of qualifications that indicated advanced training in emergency medicine and aviation operations. Jim Crawford looked up from his weather monitoring station with an expression of complete bewilderment. "That's impossible. You're the church organist." "You play hymns on Sunday mornings? You bake cookies for the hospital volunteers." "I do all of those things," Margaret confirmed, returning the ID to her wallet with the same calm precision she had maintained throughout the night. "But before I retired to this community, I spent 15 years flying medical evacuation helicopters in some of the most challenging conditions on Earth. I have over 3,000 hours of rotary wing flight time, most of it in adverse weather and combat situations." The revelation challenged fundamental assumptions that everyone in the trauma bay had made about the quiet woman who had been a fixture in their community for 5 years. Nurse Morrison remembered the countless Sunday mornings when Margaret had played softly during communion, the gentle way she had comforted grieving families after funeral services, the unassuming presence she had maintained during hospital volunteer activities. The idea that this same person had commanded military flight operations in combat zones seemed to defy rational comprehension. "Even if that's true," Jim Crawford said, his voice carrying the stubborn authority of someone whose professional expertise was being challenged, "you're not certified to fly medical transport helicopters in civilian operations. The FAA requirements are completely different from military qualifications, and insurance regulations wouldn't cover an unauthorized flight." Margaret turned to face him with the kind of steady gaze that had intimidated junior officers and earned respect from senior commanders during her military career. "Mr. Crawford, I hold current FAA commercial helicopter ratings with instrument and emergency medical services endorsements. I maintain my certifications through annual training requirements, and I'm qualified to fly the Augusta A-109 under both normal and emergency conditions." Quote. The statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that it left no room for argument, but it raised questions that seemed almost as incredible as the original revelation. How had a retired military officer maintained civilian aviation certifications while living quietly in a small mountain community? Why had she never mentioned her qualifications during the years she had been volunteering at the hospital where medical helicopters were a routine presence? The emergency authorization protocols, Dr. Hendricks said, beginning to understand the implications of what Margaret was suggesting. Do they actually permit flights during declared disaster conditions? Federal Emergency Management Agency regulations allow qualified pilots to operate medical aircraft during disaster situations when normal services are unavailable, Margaret confirmed. The hospital administrator's communication with FEMA earlier tonight established the legal framework. The question now is whether you're willing to authorize a flight that exceeds normal risk parameters but remains within emergency operational guidelines. The words carried the weight of professional knowledge and legal authority, but they also carried the unmistakable implication that Margaret was prepared to undertake a mission that other qualified pilots had already declared impossible. Jim Crawford had 20 years of mountain flying experience and an impeccable safety record built on conservative decision-making, but he had refused to attempt what this church organist was now proposing to accomplish. "The weather conditions haven't changed," Jim protested, gesturing toward his monitoring equipment where wind speed readings continued to show sustained velocities over 90 miles per hour. The downdrafts through the mountain passes would destroy any aircraft that tried to navigate them. "I don't care what your military record says. Physics doesn't respect rank or experience." Margaret walked to his weather station and began studying the radar imagery and atmospheric data with the systematic attention of someone trained to extract tactical information from complex meteorological displays. Her eyes moved across the screen in a pattern that suggested familiarity with advanced weather interpretation techniques, focusing on areas where pressure gradients and wind patterns might create navigable corridors through otherwise impossible conditions. "The Columbia River Gorge is indeed impassable," she agreed, pointing to areas on the radar display where concentrated storm activity showed the most severe conditions. "But the southern approach, following the Clackamas River Valley and staying below the ridgelines, offers more stable air masses. The terrain features provide natural windbreaks that would reduce turbulence to manageable levels." She traced a route on the screen that avoided the primary mountain passes while following river valleys and natural terrain features that would offer protection from the worst wind conditions. The path was longer than conventional flight routes, adding perhaps 30 minutes to the normal transit time, but it utilized geographical characteristics that would create relatively calm air in the midst of the regional storm system. "I've flown similar terrain in Afghanistan," she continued, her voice carrying the confidence of someone recalling successful missions rather than theoretical possibilities. "The principles of mountain weather navigation are universal. Understanding how air masses interact with topographical features, finding the corridors where natural barriers provide protection from severe wind conditions." Dr. Hendricks watched the exchange between the two pilots with growing hope tempered by persistent uncertainty. Margaret's qualifications seemed genuine. Her knowledge of aviation weather was clearly extensive, but the flight she was proposing remained far beyond anything that normal emergency medical services would attempt. The decision to authorize such a mission would place enormous responsibility on her shoulders, potentially risking multiple lives in an attempt to save one. "If you're really qualified to make this flight," she said carefully, "why didn't you speak up earlier? We've been struggling with this situation for hours, and people have been dismissing you as a well-meaning volunteer." Margaret's expression softened slightly, revealing something of the personal cost that maintaining her civilian anonymity had required. "When I retired from military service, I made a conscious decision to leave that part of my life behind. This community accepted me as Margaret Chen, the church organist, and I found peace in that identity. I've never wanted to be defined by my military service or have people treat me differently because of what I used to do." Quote, the explanation resonated with the kind of authentic emotion that couldn't be fabricated, revealing the human complexity behind her earlier reticence to become involved in aviation discussions. She had built a new life in Millbrook based on gentler pursuits: music, faith, community service, and the revelation of her military background threatened to complicate relationships she had spent years developing. "But your patient is dying," she continued, returning her attention to Marcus Bellefonte's increasingly unstable vital signs, "and conventional solutions have failed. Sometimes circumstances require us to use capabilities we'd prefer to keep private." Eleanor Bellefonte, who had been listening to the conversation from her position beside her husband's bed, looked up with the desperate hope of someone who had watched all other options disappear. "You really think you can get him to Portland in this weather?" Margaret met her gaze with honest assessment rather than false reassurance. "Mrs. Bellefonte, I can tell you that the flight is possible with appropriate precautions and emergency procedures. The weather conditions are severe, but not beyond the capabilities of the aircraft or a properly qualified pilot. However, there are risks involved that exceed normal medical transport operations. The honesty was both comforting and frightening, acknowledging danger while offering competent expertise to manage it. Eleanor had been married to a logger for 41 years, understood that mountain life sometimes required accepting calculated risks when the alternative was certain loss. She looked at her husband's gray face, at the cardiac monitor showing increasingly erratic patterns, and made the kind of decision that rural people had been making for generations. "Please," she said simply, "if there's a chance, any chance at all, please try." Dr. Hendricks felt the weight of medical authority settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. The decision to authorize an unauthorized emergency flight during severe weather conditions would challenge every protocol she had been trained to follow, would expose the hospital to liability issues that could threaten its continued operation. But Marcus Bellefonte was going to die without immediate intervention, and conventional rescue resources had proven inadequate to the current emergency. "What would you need from us?" she asked Margaret, the question carrying the implication of authorization even before the words were formally spoken. "Medical support equipment for patient stabilization during transport," Margaret replied, already shifting into the operational planning mode that had characterized her military service. "Portable cardiac monitor, emergency medications, oxygen supply, and warming blankets. The flight will take approximately 90 minutes under current conditions, possibly longer if I have to deviate significantly to avoid severe turbulence areas." Jim Crawford stepped forward with visible agitation, unable to accept that his professional authority was being superseded by someone he had dismissed as an amateur volunteer. "Doctor, I have to formally object to this plan. Regardless of Mrs. Chen's claimed qualifications, this flight violates every safety protocol established for civilian medical aviation. If something goes wrong, the liability issues alone could destroy this hospital." "If we don't try," Dr. Hendricks replied, "Marcus Bellefonte dies tonight, and we have to explain to his family why we chose regulatory compliance over a patient's life when we had a qualified pilot willing to attempt a rescue." The words carried finality, marking the moment when institutional caution gave way to individual courage, when the normal rules that governed medical practice yielded to the extraordinary circumstances that demanded extraordinary responses. Margaret nodded her acknowledgement of the authorization, already mentally reviewing the pre-flight procedures that would prepare the Augusta for immediate departure. "I'll need 15 minutes to prepare the aircraft," she said, heading toward the maintenance corridor that would take her back to the helicopter pad. "Please have the patient ready for transport, with all necessary medical equipment, when I return." Behind her, the trauma bay erupted in controlled activity as medical staff began preparing Marcus Bellefonte for the most dangerous ambulance ride of his life, while outside the storm continued its assault on the hospital with undiminished fury, unaware that one small woman had decided to challenge its dominion over life and death in the mountains. The maintenance access door slammed shut behind Margaret as she stepped back into the fury of the storm, but this time her movements carried the purposeful efficiency of someone executing a planned mission rather than conducting reconnaissance. The wind still howled with undiminished force, driving snow horizontally across the helicopter pad with enough velocity to sting exposed skin, but she no longer fought against the conditions. Instead, she worked with them, using her understanding of wind patterns and terrain effects to move efficiently across the ice-covered concrete. Margaret moved across the helicopter pad with practiced efficiency, her boots finding purchase on ice-covered concrete, while the wind attempted to drive her sideways with each gust. The Augusta A109 sat where she had left it, accumulating additional snow but remaining structurally sound despite the punishment it had been receiving from the storm. She began removing tie-down straps and protective covers with swift, economical movements, each action performed in the precise sequence she had learned during thousands of hours of pre-flight preparations in conditions ranging from desert sandstorms to Arctic blizzards. The rotor blades required careful attention, their aerodynamic surfaces crusted with ice that would disrupt airflow and create dangerous vibrations during flight operations. Margaret produced a collapsible ice scraper from her coat pocket, working methodically along each blade to remove the accumulated frozen precipitation. The process was physically demanding in the severe wind conditions, requiring her to brace herself against the aircraft while maintaining the delicate touch necessary to avoid damaging the precisely manufactured rotor surfaces. Ice removal from the engine intakes proved more challenging, requiring her to climb onto the aircraft's nose section while wind gusts threatened to knock her off balance. She worked with the systematic thoroughness that had kept her alive during similar operations in Afghanistan, where failure to properly prepare aircraft often resulted in catastrophic mechanical failures during critical missions. The Augusta's engines were sophisticated turbine units that required unrestricted airflow to operate efficiently, and even small amounts of ice debris could cause compressor stalls or complete power loss during the demanding flight conditions she was about to encounter. The cockpit door opened easily despite the cold temperatures, revealing familiar instrument layouts that differed in detail but not in fundamental design from the military helicopters she had flown for 15 years. Margaret slid into the pilot's seat and began the startup sequence, her hands moving across switches and controls with muscle memory that transcended the years since her last combat mission. The auxiliary power unit whined to life, providing electrical power to warm the engines and activate the sophisticated avionics systems that would be essential for navigation in zero-visibility conditions. Engine startup proceeded normally despite the brutal ambient temperatures, the twin Pratt & Whitney turbines spooling up with the characteristic whine that indicated proper operation. Margaret monitored engine parameters on the multifunction displays, watching oil pressure and turbine temperature readings climb into normal operating ranges, while the aircraft systems performed their automated diagnostic sequences. The Augusta was responding well to the cold weather startup procedures, its Canadian-designed systems proving their worth in conditions that would challenge aircraft built for more temperate climates. The medical team arrived at the helicopter pad as Margaret completed her instrument checks, their approach hampered by wind conditions that made normal walking nearly impossible. Dr. Hendricks and Nurse Morrison flanked a wheeled stretcher carrying Marcus Bellefonte, who had been sedated and intubated for the flight, but remained conscious enough to track their movements with frightened eyes. Portable medical equipment was secured to the stretcher frame: cardiac monitor, oxygen supply, emergency medications, and the warming blankets that would be essential for maintaining body temperature during the flight. Loading the patient required precise coordination between medical and aviation personnel, with Margaret directing the process from the cockpit while the medical team maneuvered the stretcher through the Augusta's cabin door. The aircraft's medical configuration included built-in mounting points for stretchers and life support equipment, but securing everything properly in the severe wind conditions proved challenging. Loose equipment would become dangerous projectiles during the turbulent flight conditions they were about to encounter. "Patient is stable for transport," Dr. Hendricks reported through the aircraft's intercom system, her voice barely audible above the wind noise that penetrated even the insulated cabin. "Cardiac rhythm is being maintained with medication, but we're approaching the limits of what pharmaceutical intervention can accomplish. He needs that surgery within the next 90 minutes. Margaret acknowledged the medical update while completing her final pre-flight checks, verifying that navigation systems were properly configured and communication equipment was functioning despite the electromagnetic interference created by the storm system. The weather radar showed a solid wall of precipitation extending from ground level to over 20,000 feet, with embedded areas of severe turbulence that would challenge even military aircraft designed for adverse weather operations. "Tower, this is Medical Transport 7 requesting immediate departure clearance," she transmitted on the emergency frequency, knowing that the local air traffic control facility had been evacuated hours earlier, but maintaining proper radio procedures nevertheless. The response was predictable silence, confirming that they would be operating without external navigation assistance or traffic control services. Margaret engaged the rotor system and felt the familiar vibration as the main blades began their rotation, slowly at first but accelerating toward the revolution rate necessary for flight operations. The Augusta lifted slightly on its landing gear as rotor thrust began to overcome the aircraft's weight, a subtle indication that the machine was ready to leave the ground, despite conditions that would normally prevent any rational pilot from attempting takeoff. The moment of liftoff came without fanfare or dramatic gestures, just the gradual transition from ground contact to sustained flight as Margaret applied collective pitch and felt the helicopter rise into the storm. Wind immediately began buffeting the aircraft with forces that would have been unmanageable for a less experienced pilot, but she compensated with subtle control inputs that kept the Augusta stable, despite the chaotic air masses surrounding them. Visibility dropped to zero within seconds of leaving the hospital pad, the world outside the cockpit windows becoming an undifferentiated gray mass of blowing snow and cloud. Margaret transitioned immediately to instrument flight procedures, her eyes scanning the electronic displays that provided artificial representations of attitude, altitude, and airspeed when visual references were unavailable. The aircraft's sophisticated autopilot system offered assistance, but she maintained manual control, trusting her own reflexes and experience over automated systems that might not respond appropriately to the extreme conditions they were encountering. The first major challenge came as they climbed through 500 feet altitude, where the storm's full fury was unleashed without the moderating influence of ground terrain. Wind shear struck the Augusta like an invisible fist, dropping the aircraft 200 feet in less than 3 seconds while subjecting everyone aboard to gravitational forces that approached the limits of human tolerance. Margaret fought the controls, using engine power and rotor pitch adjustments to arrest the descent and regain stable flight attitude. "Medical team, report patient status," she called through the intercom, concerned that the violent turbulence might have disrupted the life support equipment keeping Marcus Bellefonte alive during transport. "Patient is stable," came Dr. Hendricks' strained reply, her voice indicating that she was fighting motion sickness while trying to monitor medical equipment that was being subjected to forces no hospital room had ever experienced. "Cardiac rhythm is holding, but we're having trouble maintaining IV access with this turbulence level." Margaret adjusted her flight path slightly southward, following the terrain contours she had memorized during her earlier planning session. The southern approach to Portland would take them through river valleys where mountain ridges would provide some protection from the worst wind conditions. But it required precise navigation in zero visibility conditions, where a navigation error of even a few degrees could result in controlled flight into terrain. The Clackamas River Valley opened below them as they descended to a more manageable altitude, though below and above were relative concepts when visibility was measured in yards rather than miles. Margaret flew by instruments and terrain memory, visualizing the landscape from years of studying topographical maps and conducting similar flights in equally challenging conditions. The Augusta's terrain-following radar provided some assistance, but she relied primarily on her own knowledge and experience to navigate between obstacles that remained invisible until they were close enough to be immediately dangerous. 20 minutes into the flight, they encountered the first of several microbursts that characterized severe storm systems in mountainous terrain. The aircraft dropped 500 feet in 10 seconds, its descent rate exceeding the capabilities of the rotor system to maintain controlled flight. Margaret applied maximum power and aggressive control inputs, pulling the Augusta out of its dive with less than 100 feet of altitude remaining above the invisible terrain below. The maneuver subjected everyone aboard to gravitational forces approaching 4 times normal body weight, but it prevented what would have been a fatal impact with the mountainside. "That was too close," Dr. Hendricks commented through gritted teeth, her medical training providing enough aviation knowledge to understand that they had just survived a near miss with catastrophic ground impact. "The terrain provides both obstacles and protection," Margaret replied, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the adrenaline surge that accompanied emergency flight maneuvers. "We're flying through wind shadow areas that offer more stable air, but the margins for error are smaller than normal flight operations." The patient monitoring equipment began showing irregular readings as Marcus Bellefonte's medical condition responded to the stress of extreme flight conditions. His cardiac rhythm, which had been stabilized through pharmaceutical intervention, began showing signs of deterioration as his body struggled to cope with the gravitational forces and oxygen pressure changes associated with the turbulent flight. Dr. Hendricks adjusted medication dosages while fighting the motion sickness that threatened to compromise her ability to provide medical care. "We're losing cardiac stability," she reported, her voice carrying the tension of someone watching a patient's condition deteriorate in real time. "The stress of the flight is overwhelming his cardiovascular system." "How much longer until we reach Portland?" Margaret checked her navigation display, calculating their progress against the flight plan she had filed mentally before departure. The storm conditions were forcing her to fly a longer route than she had originally intended, following terrain features that provided protection from the worst turbulence, but added precious minutes to their transit time. They were perhaps halfway to their destination, but the most challenging portion of the flight lay ahead, where they would have to transition from the protected river valleys to the more exposed terrain surrounding Portland's metropolitan area. 45 minutes to Portland approach," she replied, making rapid calculations that balanced flight safety against medical urgency. "I can attempt a more direct route that would save time, but it would expose us to more severe weather conditions." The decision belonged to Dr. Hendricks as the medical authority aboard the aircraft, but it required her to balance competing risks, the danger of continuing their current cautious approach against the danger of exposing a critically ill patient to even more violent flight conditions. Marcus Bellefonte's cardiac monitor showed increasingly irregular patterns, suggesting that time was becoming more critical than flight safety considerations. "Take the direct route," she decided, her voice carrying the authority of someone making life-and-death decisions under impossible circumstances. "We're going to lose him anyway if we don't get him to surgery soon." Margaret acknowledged the decision and began adjusting their flight path toward the more direct routing that would take them over higher terrain, where wind conditions were more severe but distance to their destination was minimized. The Augusta climbed through increasingly turbulent air masses, its engines working at maximum power to maintain altitude and airspeed, in conditions that were testing the aircraft's design limitations. The next 30 minutes became a continuous battle between human skill and natural forces that seemed determined to prevent their mission from succeeding. Margaret flew with the kind of intense concentration that excluded everything, except the immediate requirements of keeping the aircraft airborne and moving toward their destination. Control inputs became instinctive responses to atmospheric conditions that changed from second to second, requiring adjustments to power settings, rotor pitch, and flight attitude that demanded perfect coordination between her hands, feet, and eyes. Wind shear continued to assault the Augusta with unpredictable violence, creating flight conditions that would have destroyed lesser aircraft or overwhelmed pilots with less experience in extreme weather operations. Margaret compensated for each atmospheric disturbance with control inputs that seemed to anticipate the aircraft's response, her understanding of helicopter aerodynamics allowing her to work with the machine's natural characteristics rather than fighting against them. Behind her in the medical compartment, Dr. Hendricks fought her own battle to keep Marcus Bellefonte alive, while the aircraft bucked and twisted through turbulence that made normal medical procedures nearly impossible. IV lines threatened to disconnect with each violent maneuver, monitoring equipment struggled to maintain accurate readings in the chaotic environment, and the patient's cardiovascular system continued to deteriorate under stresses that no medical textbook had prepared her to handle. The lights of Portland began to appear through the storm as they approached the metropolitan area, faint glimmers of civilization that marked their proximity to the medical facilities that could save Marcus Bellefonte's life. But the final approach to Oregon Health Sciences University would prove to be the most challenging portion of the flight, requiring Margaret to navigate through urban terrain, where buildings and communication towers created additional hazards in zero-visibility conditions. The Portland metropolitan area materialized through the storm as a constellation of scattered lights, their intensity diminished by the thick precipitation that continued to assault the Augusta's windscreen. Margaret's navigation display showed Oregon Health Sciences University Hospital rising from the hills above the city center, its distinctive complex of buildings connected by skyways and surrounded by the kind of precision-maintained helipads that served Level 1 trauma centers. The final approach would require her to navigate between communication towers and building structures, while descending through the most turbulent air masses she had encountered during the entire flight. OHSU's emergency frequency crackled to life as their aircraft appeared on the hospital's radar system, the voice of the flight operations coordinator carrying professional urgency, mixed with disbelief at finding an aircraft airborne during the storm conditions that had grounded all other aviation operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Medical Transport 7, this is OHSU Flight Operations. We show you inbound from the east in severe weather conditions. Please confirm your aircraft type and medical status. Quote, OHSU Flight Ops, Medical Transport 7 is an Augusta A109 with critical cardiac patient requiring immediate surgical intervention, Margaret responded, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the violent turbulence that was making radio communication difficult. Patient is a 62-year-old male in ventricular tachycardia, stable for transport but approaching critical threshold for surgical intervention. The response carried amazement that anyone had attempted flight operations in the current weather conditions, but quickly shifted to the operational efficiency that characterized major trauma centers during emergency situations. Medical Transport 7, we have surgical teams standing by and helipad cleared for immediate approach. Be advised, wind conditions at field level are gusting to 75 knots with severe crosswind components. Emergency vehicles are positioned for immediate patient transfer. Margaret acknowledged the landing clearance while fighting control inputs that required constant adjustment to maintain stable flight attitude in the chaotic air masses surrounding Portland's urban terrain. The city's buildings created their own weather patterns, channeling wind into unpredictable directions and creating downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the ground without warning. She had flown similar approaches during urban combat operations in Iraq, but never in weather conditions that would have challenged military pilots with specialized training in extreme environment operations. The OHSU helipad appeared through the storm as a circle of red and white lights, their intensity barely visible through the blowing snow but providing the visual reference she needed for the final approach phase. Margaret began her descent with incremental power reductions, fighting crosswinds that threatened to push the Augusta sideways into the hospital buildings that rose on three sides of the landing area. The approach required her to compensate for wind conditions that were changing direction and velocity every few seconds, demanding control inputs that seemed to anticipate atmospheric disturbances rather than simply responding to them. Dr. Hendricks' voice came through the intercom with increasing urgency as Marcus Bellefonte's condition continued to deteriorate during the final minutes of their flight. Patient is showing signs of cardiac arrest. I'm preparing to begin CPR if his rhythm degrades further. We need to get him to surgery immediately upon landing. The cardiac monitor's alarm began sounding its electronic warning as Marcus's heart rhythm devolved into the chaotic electrical activity that preceded complete cardiovascular collapse. Dr. Hendricks positioned herself to begin chest compressions while the Augusta bucked through the final approach phase, her medical training adapting to provide life support in conditions no hospital had ever prepared her to handle. The aircraft's violent motion made effective CPR nearly impossible, but she maintained the rhythmic compressions that were keeping blood flowing to Marcus's brain and vital organs. Margaret increased her rate of descent, accepting higher risks during the landing phase in order to minimize the time Marcus would spend in cardiac arrest before reaching the surgical suite. The Augusta descended through wind shear that would have been considered prohibitive under normal circumstances, but she compensated with power adjustments and control inputs that kept the aircraft stable despite atmospheric conditions that seemed designed to prevent successful landing operations. The helipad rushed up to meet them as Margaret flared the Augusta's descent with precisely timed control inputs, the aircraft's skids touching concrete with a firm impact that indicated successful completion of one of the most challenging flights in civilian medical aviation history. Emergency medical personnel were already running toward the aircraft before the rotor blades had stopped turning, their approach coordinated with the efficiency that characterized Level 1 trauma centers during critical patient arrivals. Margaret shut down the engines and opened the cockpit door as the medical team reached the Augusta, their movements demonstrating the kind of practiced urgency that suggested they understood the criticality of Marcus Bellefonte's condition. The lead physician, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, had been monitoring radio communications during their approach and was prepared for the cardiac emergency that awaited them in the aircraft's medical compartment. Patient is in cardiac arrest, Dr. Hendricks reported, as the OHSU team took control of the stretcher, her voice carrying the strain of someone who had been providing emergency medical care under impossible conditions. VFib rhythm, approximately 3 minutes of CPR during final approach. He needs immediate catheter lab intervention. Quote, the transfer from aircraft to hospital proceeded with choreographed precision, the OHSU medical team moving Marcus Bellefonte from the helicopter pad to the cardiac catheterization laboratory in less than 4 minutes. Margaret watched the evacuation from her position beside the Augusta, noting the professional competence that would give Marcus his best chance of surviving the cardiac emergency that had nearly killed him during their flight through the storm. Dr. Martinez paused beside the aircraft before following her patient into the hospital, her expression showing the kind of professional respect that experienced emergency physicians reserved for colleagues who had demonstrated exceptional competence under extreme circumstances. That was an incredible piece of flying, Colonel. I've been working trauma medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone attempt a flight in conditions like this. The use of Margaret's military rank surprised her, suggesting that her identity had somehow become known during the brief time since their arrival. Dr. Martinez noticed her confusion and offered a brief explanation. We ran your aircraft registration while you were inbound. When we saw that a retired Army flight surgeon was piloting an unauthorized medical evacuation through a 100-year storm, we knew we were dealing with someone special. Margaret deflected the praise with the same quiet professionalism she had maintained throughout the night, uncomfortable with attention that focused on her personal accomplishments rather than the patient whose life had been saved through collective effort. Your surgical team will determine the outcome, Doctor. I just provided transportation. The OHSU flight operations coordinator approached as Dr. Martinez disappeared into the hospital, his expression showing the kind of amazement that came from witnessing events that challenged professional understanding of what was possible under extreme conditions. Tom Brennan had been coordinating medical helicopter operations for 15 years, had seen remarkable flying during emergency situations, but nothing that compared to the flight he had just witnessed through weather conditions that had grounded every other aircraft in the region. "Colonel Chen, I have to ask, how did you navigate through those conditions without GPS assistance?" "Our weather radar showed solid precipitation from ground level to 20,000 feet, with wind shear that should have made flight operations impossible. Margaret secured the Augustus systems and completed the post-flight procedures that would prepare the aircraft for return to Cedar Valley, her actions demonstrating the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her entire aviation career. Visual flight rules don't apply when visibility is zero, but terrain navigation principles remain constant. Understanding how weather interacts with topographical features, finding the corridors where natural barriers provide protection from severe atmospheric disturbances." The explanation was factually accurate but understated the remarkable flying skills that had been required to navigate through mountain terrain in zero visibility conditions, while maintaining stable flight attitudes despite turbulence that would have defeated most pilots. Tom Brennan recognized the modesty that often characterized military aviators when discussing their accomplishments, but he also understood that he had witnessed flying that exceeded anything he had encountered during his civilian aviation career. Inside the hospital, Marcus Bellefonte was already in the cardiac catheterization laboratory, where Dr. Sarah Kim, OHSU's Chief of Interventional Cardiology, was preparing to perform the ablation procedure that would correct the electrical conduction abnormalities threatening his life. The surgery would take approximately 2 hours under normal circumstances, but Marcus's condition had been compromised by the cardiac episodes he had experienced during transport, requiring additional procedures to stabilize his cardiovascular system before the primary intervention could be completed. Margaret completed her aircraft inspection and began preparing for the return flight to Cedar Valley, though weather conditions remained severe enough to challenge even her exceptional flying skills. The storm system was beginning to show signs of weakening as it moved eastward, but wind speeds and visibility conditions were still far beyond the parameters that would normally permit safe flight operations. The return trip would be marginally less dangerous than the outbound flight, but it would still require the same kind of precision flying that had brought them safely to Portland. Her satellite phone rang as she finished checking the Augusta's engine parameters, the caller ID showing Cedar Valley Medical Center's emergency number. Dr. Hendricks' voice came through clearly despite the electronic interference caused by the storm system, carrying news that Marcus Bellefonte had been successfully connected to the heart-lung bypass machine and that Dr. Kim was confident about correcting the underlying cardiac abnormalities. "Margaret, I can't adequately express what you've accomplished tonight," Dr. Hendricks said, her voice carrying genuine emotion despite the professional distance that normally characterized physician-to-physician communications. "You've saved a man's life under conditions that every expert said made rescue impossible." The words carried more weight than formal recognition or official commendations, representing acknowledgement from a colleague who understood the medical and aviation challenges that had been overcome during the night's events. Margaret accepted the gratitude with characteristic understatement, deflecting personal praise toward the collaborative effort that had made the mission successful. "The outcome will be determined by Dr. Kim's surgical skills and Marcus's recovery process," she replied, checking weather updates that showed marginal improvement in flight conditions for the return journey. "I'll be departing Portland in 15 minutes and should be back at Cedar Valley within 2 hours." The return flight proceeded with less drama than the outbound journey, partly because weather conditions were gradually improving, but primarily because Margaret now had intimate knowledge of the terrain features and atmospheric patterns that had challenged her during the initial flight through the storm. She followed the same route in reverse, using river valleys and natural windbreaks to minimize exposure to the most severe turbulence, while maintaining sufficient altitude to clear obstacles that remained invisible in the persistent low-visibility conditions. Cedar Valley Medical Center's helicopter pad came into view 90 minutes after departure from Portland, the familiar red and white lights marking the end of a mission that had required her to utilize every skill developed during 15 years of military aviation service. The Augusta touched down with the same firm precision that had characterized the entire flight, its engines winding down as Margaret completed the shutdown procedures that would prepare the aircraft for normal operations, when weather conditions improved sufficiently for routine medical transport missions. Jim Crawford was waiting beside the helipad as Margaret exited the cockpit, his expression showing the complexity of emotions that accompanied the realization that his professional assessment had been proven wrong by someone he had dismissed as an unqualified volunteer. The conversation that followed was brief and professional, focusing on aircraft condition and operational requirements rather than the personal dynamics that had characterized their earlier interactions. The Augusta performed flawlessly, Margaret reported, handling the aircraft logbook and maintenance records that documented the flight's technical parameters. No mechanical issues. Engines operated within normal parameters throughout the mission. The aircraft is ready for service pending routine post-flight inspection. She walked away from the helicopter pad with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the night, leaving Jim Crawford to contemplate the gap between professional credentials and actual capability that had been so dramatically demonstrated during the evening's events. Behind her, the Augusta sat ready for its next mission, bearing no visible evidence of the extraordinary flight that had just saved Marcus Bellefonte's life during one of the worst storms in regional memory. The hospital corridors were quieter now, the emergency department having returned to more normal activity levels as the storm began to subside and other medical crises were resolved through conventional means. Margaret made her way to the chapel where the night had begun, settling into the same back pew where she had been found hours earlier, when the mission that would test every skill she possessed was just beginning to take shape in Dr. Hendricks' desperate imagination. 3 weeks later, Margaret Chen sat at the church organ as she had every Sunday morning for 5 years, her fingers moving across the keys with the same gentle precision that had guided a medical helicopter through impossible weather. The congregation of First Methodists sang "Amazing Grace," while snow fell softly outside the stained-glass windows, a peaceful contrast to the fury they had all survived during what meteorologists were now calling the storm of the century. Marcus Bellefonte occupied his usual pew beside Eleanor, his recovery complete, and his gratitude expressed through the kind of quiet nods that mountain people used when words felt inadequate. Dr. Kim's surgery had been successful, correcting the cardiac abnormalities that would have killed him without the flight that every aviation expert had declared impossible. The story had made regional newspapers for a few days, but the headlines focused on the storm's record-breaking statistics rather than the church organist who had challenged nature and won. Margaret preferred it that way. She had returned to her volunteer rounds at the hospital, still bringing cookies to the night shift, still playing piano for patients who couldn't sleep. Only now, when she walked past the helicopter pad, Jim Crawford offered respectful nods instead of dismissive glances. Dr. Hendricks sometimes paused in her rounds to share coffee and conversation about cases that required unconventional solutions. The hospital staff knew they worked alongside someone extraordinary, but they also understood that extraordinary people often wore the most ordinary disguises. As the final hymn ended, and the congregation filed out into the gentle snowfall, Margaret remained at the organ bench for a moment longer. Her hands rested quietly on the keys that had been her public identity for 5 years, while her eyes tracked a medical helicopter passing overhead on a routine flight, the kind of mission that was only possible because storms eventually pass and the impossible sometimes becomes merely difficult for those willing to try. If this story of quiet courage and hidden strength moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered someone whose true capabilities surprised everyone around them? Share your own stories of unrecognized heroes, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things when it matters most.